众所周知，在即将过去的这个2020年的全年里，人类都在新冠疫情大流行的阴影下笼罩着。在科学界、医药界未能彻底解决疫苗难题以及完全控制病毒变异之前，这道已经造成世界人口死亡人数近乎200万的可怕阴影，始终都会如影随形，挥之不去，依旧会给全世界持续造成各式各样的重击和创伤。世界卫生组织的一项最新的调查显示，由于疫情的影响，全球93%的国家已经中断或停止了精神卫生服务，而人们对精神卫生的需求却又在急剧的增加中。为此，世卫组织的专家预测，抑郁症将成为2021年第2大疾病负担。有鉴于此，新闻特别在视频的最后放上了一段时长约1个小时的英国已故著名心理学专家克莱尔·威克斯博士在上世纪的有趣访谈。虽然过去了差不多40年，但人类思想的提炼和精神层面的财富却是永续永恒的。顺便提一句，抑郁症是意志向下的，而焦虑者是惊恐向上的，两者是互通共存的。新冠肆虐腾逐浪。根据世界著名的位于法国巴黎的市场调研公司易普所的一份面向16个国家的调查报告，失眠、焦虑和抑郁已经成为了疫情期间大多数被访者所要面临的头号症状和心理问题。而且世卫组织着重提到了，对于常年被精神疾病困扰的人来说，疫情期间这些人比以往任何时候都遭受到了更加严重的歧视。而在中国，一份精神卫生调查的结果显示，中国约有17%的人口受到了各类精神和心理问题的困扰，而社会对于精神病患的歧视则是影响治疗的关键因素之一。为此，中国疾病预防控制中心坦言，中国抑郁症患者已经达到 2.1%， 也就是说1万个人里面就有210个抑郁患者。14亿人口计算的话，全国范围内有近3000万的抑郁患者。解决这个后新冠的头号问题已经成为当务之急。乌云滂沱卷泥丸。为此，世卫组织提醒公众说，精神健康对于人类的整体健康至关重要，跟身体的健康同样重要。如果大家在疫情期间遇到了精神的困扰，一定要及时的跟信任的人沟通交流，如有必要，更应该直接寻求专业人士的帮助。当抑郁症持续存在，并跟其他生理、心理和社会等因素相互纠缠时，它可能最终导致自杀。跟抑郁症一样，自杀不会区分任何人，无论穷人还是富人，无论歌手还是医生。根据世卫组织提供的数据显示，全世界每年大约有80万的人死于自杀，相当于每秒就有1个人了结了自己的生命，数字相当的惊人。狂飙万山千里雪。如果踏上了抑郁症的险途，就等于踏上了艰苦的长征。那么，面对2021年更加压力山大的抑郁症挑战，我们应该如何去面对呢？有关专家提供了2个有效的办法，而轻重缓急则因人而异。第一，不要讳疾忌医，要正确采用药物的治疗。抑郁症比较严重的话，最好还是需要药物的参与。一般情况下，使用抗抑郁药物之后，就可以消除不良的情绪，对抑郁症的快速控制相当的有利。只是不要过度的依赖药物就好，因为心病还需心药医，真正的心药就是心理治疗。大疫过后尽开颜。还是那句话，人生不如意十常八九，看透了，看开了，就看化了，开心了。面对抑郁症，最好的办法 就是心药，所以第二个方法就是强大可靠的心理治疗。抑郁症最需要的就是及时的发现和治疗。如果在一段时间内出现了显著和持久的情绪萎靡、心情低落，就应该马上进行心理的治疗，防患于未然。比如马上转移自己的注意力，通过任何可以转移注意力的方式，都能改善并缓解抑郁症的搅扰与恶化。特别是这个漫长的疫情期间，许多人都不得不选择独处，个人情绪很容易为此而失控。如果主动选择或被动无奈的去专注某一件相当负面的事情，就极有可能引发抑郁情绪频繁发生，最终导致无法自拔。因此，转移自己的注意力就是多做自己感兴趣的事情，思考让自己快乐的话题，或者干脆简单粗暴地关注新闻的频道也行。总之，跳出消极的网罗，寻找积极的元素，就能转移负面的专注，消除不良的情绪。在人们注意力分散的时候，抑郁的感觉就会减轻了不少。坚持做快乐的事情，自然就会形成良好的循环，从而进入无药而医的最高境界。新冠肆虐腾浊浪，乌云滂沱卷泥丸，狂飙万山千里雪，大疫过后尽开颜。2021年，新冠病毒的阴影及其衍生出来的各种困难与问题，依旧会为人类带来无尽的头痛和感伤。但人类的智慧总在进步，总在学习，也总在成长。12月28号，著名的钢琴家傅聪就是因为感染上了这个新冠病毒，不幸在英国逝世，享年86岁。他的父亲，也就是著名翻译家傅雷，曾经在《傅雷家书》中说过这样一句无奈而淡定、简单又深邃的话。他说：人生的关是过不完的，等到过得差不多的时候，又要离开世界了。新闻以为他仿佛正在提醒着我们这些依旧在世界上顽强活着的人们，新冠病毒是人类的关，人类的坎，不要为这些困难所捆绑，裹足不前。不要让我们的眼睛单单专注于这些眼前的负面情绪和难题阻碍上。人生很短也很长，这些脚下的关，这些脚下的坎儿，注定是过不完的。且让我们的眼目放长放远，多些动心的回忆或者美好的念想，去转移我们的负念、失眠、焦虑或者抑郁。我们就会在不知不觉中走完了这些关，走过了这些坎儿，您说对吧？新闻欢迎您在评论区中各抒己见，畅所欲言。
Manifest itself as edginess or fatigue, that not quite coping with life feeling. Or, at its most extreme, it can cripple the sufferer, often ruining his life and that of his family, as loved ones try to cope with the mass of confusing symptoms which can accompany the anxiety state. Well, many families suffered in this way for years until they found help in the teachings of a doctor who has become internationally acclaimed for her understanding and treatment of nervous illness, Dr. Claire Weeks. Through her books and tapes, she's helped literally thousands of patients worldwide. With her deep insight into the cause of their nervous illness and her compassionate understanding of the simple road to recovery, she teaches patients that they've often become trapped in a cycle of nervous suffering by worrying more about the state they're in, the symptoms themselves, than the original cause of their illness. Over the last few years, I've interviewed Dr. Weeks on a number of occasions about her life's work in treating nervous illness. This compilation of those talks represents a unique record of Dr. Weeks' approach to treating the anxiety state, depression, obsessions, and phobias. But first, we meet Anne, our patient. Her pattern of illness began simply, but progressed unchecked into the horrors of an obsessional anxiety state.
You can't get rid of an obsession by going in and stopping out. Sometimes with phobias, you can stay in. If you've got agoraphobia, you can stay in and you can get a measure of relief when you're not fighting with it all the time. But with obsessions, you can't, because they're in your head and you carry them around wherever you go, sleeping and waking. They're there. And they're not just as large as life, they're 10 times larger and much more frightening. It's a bit like being in a room with a horror movie. And there's a great big screen and it's in full stereophonic sound and glorious technicolor, and there's someone saying, watch and listen, and it going on and you're terrified. And you can't get out of the room and you can't turn it off, and it goes on and on and on and on till you believe it can't go on any longer, and it still does. And you get in such a terrible state, and then you get in a state of shock and you can't keep a limb still, and you're sick all the time, sick at the drop of the hat, and you lose an awful lot of weight.
Anne is just one of many thousands helped from nervous breakdown to full health by the teachings of Dr. Claire Weeks. I asked Dr. Weeks how her work first developed in her early years.
Well, first of all, I was a physician. That's an ordinary doctor. And I learnt fairly soon that to help people, and I like people, that's another thing, you have to give them as much peace of mind as you can. But if you can send a patient away with peace of mind, half the battle is won. So that gradually got me the reputation of being a sort of person who was interested in nervous reaction of patients.
So have all your books and teaching come through your own experiences as a doctor, or have you done any specialist training the way other psychiatrists would have done?
Well, I did the normal psychiatric training, we all do as we go through, but I then knew I had myself been nervously exhausted, and you learn a lot, and especially when I just got myself out of it. So that I found out what it was like to be nervously exhausted and how to recover from it. And you see, I started medicine when I was 37. Before that, I did science. I was over at University College here doing science, and I was able to bring to medicine, I think, perhaps a more mature attitude than if I had started at 19. I had grown to know people more than if I'd started medicine at 19. I like people, and I think that all combined to help me want to help other people very much, not just as a sort of general practitioner looking after their coughs and colds, but as a person looking after the whole person.
So what was the difference between the advice that you were giving to people and the advice that perhaps psychiatrists were giving? Well, did you have a very different technique? Is your method very different?
It is different. In fact, when my book first came out, it was called by one of the psychiatrists in Sydney as homespun philosophy. And I suppose it's just common sense. I had to see it work. As a GP, you not only see the patient when they come to you with a nervous problem, but you also see them when they come with coughs and colds and headaches. So you follow through, and I had to see it work. I think that the years I spent doing research work as a scientist helped me very much to analyze what was happening to a patient and to see the simplicity that lay behind the whole pattern of their nervous suffering. I think that being a scientist first, you do look for the trunk of the tree. You're not led away by the leaves entirely. And I was able to pick I thought, the most important part of their illness and their reactions.
Now, over the next few weeks, you're going to be giving us a lot of your sound homespun, common sense advice about how to look after our own nervousness, how to cope with it. And we're going to see, too, one lady, one patient who you have helped. But did you work with her alone, or were you working with the doctor, with Anne as well?
Always with the doctor. If any patient, anybody rings me course, they can't. I'm retired now and I'm not in practice. They communicate with me mainly by telephone or letter, and not too much telephone now, I hope. But if they do, I always get in touch with their doctor, because I find when I do this, I get a lot of good cooperation, and especially with this patient whom we will be showing. Her doctor has become one of my good friends, and even actually before we put her on film here, I rang him and said, have I, you're okay to do this? And he said, you know, a few years ago I would have hesitated, but not now. He said, I think that she is such an outstanding case that she should be shown to other people to help them.
Well, let's see now an excerpt from the conversation that she had. And we can see here just how bad the situation was for her some time ago.
I'd had desensitisation, that helped, and relaxation, that helped. I even tried hypnosis, but that didn't work because I don't hypnotise. Some people do, some people don't. I mean, everything there is going, I've had, and it didn't work. So once I started talking about leucotomy, I thought, that's it. Because, I mean, as a teenager, I knew someone that had had a leucotomy, and I'd thought from then onwards I'd die first because it hadn't been successful. And when they started talking about it with me, I thought, well, that's it. I've had enough. I'm going.
There we are, an example of the despair that Diane went through. How were you able to help her?
Marion, the others who had tried, and they tried so hard, had picked on complications. They had told her she was an aggressive type. They had gone for difficult explanations. I went for the simple one. I explained to her that this obsession that was upsetting her so much was no more than a strange thought in a tired mind. Now she could grasp that, and that was the truth, because that's all it was. She grasped it, and I taught her to glimpse it. If she could only grasp it for a few moments each day, she was seeing the truth, just for a few moments, and that's what she practiced.
And how long did it take her before she was back on her feet again? Was it just a long
Well, it's
process?
hard to remember because I was only in contact with her on the phone. You know, I only saw Anne once. It was all done through a tape recording and the telephone. I would say it took Anne about 12 months before she felt happy and at ease with the obsessions, happy to be alive again. I'd say about 12 months.
But is this what makes your work unique? The fact that you go through, that you cut away all the bits that are confusing and you go through to try and find the simple remedy?
I think that's it, Marion. I do. I try to give the patient an understanding of the simplicity and then a program with which he can follow the simple route back to normal feeling, normal intensity of feeling.
Is that what you're going to do for us over the next few weeks?
Yes, and I'm going to do it for not only the people who are nervously ill, not only open their eyes to the simplicity and the simple plan for recovering, but for other people who've never been nervously ill, so that they will lose the feeling of mystery in nervous illness, and that they will be no longer afraid to talk about it, read about it, or even to listen to me talk. There must be no mystery about nervous illness, because there is none really. I mean anxiety state, of course. It is a simple pattern of development, an almost inevitable pattern of development, and of course recovery just lies in the reversing the pattern.
The subject today is the anxiety state, Doctor, and is that the crux of the whole problem of nervous illness?
It's the commonest kind of nervous illness, Marion, the anxiety state. It really means a person who is, one could say, possessed with anxiety, which turns to fear. In my experience, there are two kinds. There's the person whose anxiety state has come about because of some problem, some sorrow or guilt, disgrace. And there's the other person who has been who has been put under stress, perhaps by some sudden stress, say a severe hemorrhage, or continuous stress, such as living with a domestic problem. And as a doctor, I found that the vast majority had no specific problem. They had become afraid of the state they were in. And to understand that, we have to understand that our nervous system has two main parts. One we call voluntary, and we can move it as we will. The other is involuntary. It controls the functioning of our organs and the registering of our emotions. Now, when under stress, emotions are registered, maybe at first simply, as one would normally experience them. Gradually, as stress progresses, the registering of the emotion becomes exaggerated, and we say that our nerves are aroused. And this can be a very painful experience. It means that an ordinary spasm of fear becomes a flash of panic. Just feeling a heartbeat becomes a consciousness of a bang, 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 bang. Or of, as the patient says, missed heartbeats, churning stomach, inability to swallow, to take in a deep breath, a feeling of weakness, almost fainting. Now, these are difficult, upsetting symptoms to live with, and they are the symptoms of stress. Now, the sufferer invariably makes the mistake of adding more stress, becoming afraid of those symptoms, and he doesn't understand them, so he adds stress to stress, and you've got he's in a cycle. The stress originally, through the hemorrhage, whatever it was, the stress of his fear, more stress symptoms, and there you have the cycle turning, and through that comes what I call not so much arousal, that's the scientific term, but sensitization. The first thing to do to help the patient reverse that cycle, it was simple, its development was simple, the cure is simple too. I didn't say easy, I said simple, is to give him understanding of the symptoms. Yes?
I was going to say, how effective is that understanding? Do you find that people respond to that quickly?
Some do, some don't. One woman just had one visit, and she was completely cured. She came back, she said, it's gone, I can't panic. No matter what I do, I went to the top of the AMP, but I can't panic. One visit with understanding cured her. But most people, the understanding has to be helped with a program for recovery. But can I explain to you just how complicated some of these symptoms can seem? You take the trembling hand, and when a person under great stress finds that their hand finally is beginning to tremble, they think, well, that's the sign of a great deterioration. They must be getting organically really involved now. They're in for some really illness, you know, that's you're losing control, old fellow, you're losing control. But actually, it can be explained as simply as the knee jerk. If you tap a person's knee and the leg extends, that is because in the tendon of the muscle there is a spindle that sends a message to the spine and back and says jerk, like that. In the muscles of the fingers there are muscle spindles, those are nerve endings, which do the same to the muscle. Those muscle spindles are acted on by adrenaline, which is one of the stress hormones, liberated by the part of the nervous system that controls the organs and the emotions. It stimulates the muscle spindles that send the same message back to the spinal cord, back to the fingers, and the muscles extend. So that is no more than a series of little finger jerks, and nothing to be afraid of. Let it jerk.
Can you control them?
Eventually, through accepting them. You see, I have to teach what to do. Explanation is not always enough. I teach facing, accepting, floating, and letting time pass. Now, facing, I'll give you an example of that. A very good example of how a man did not face and what happened. He was a Canadian, and he belonged to a group who taught that to overcome the fear of going out, one had to go as far as one could without panicking and then return. If one panicked, return straight away. And in this way, he did get used to travelling round the little village. Eventually, he went to Las Vegas and back, had a fortnight, and he didn't panic once. And he came back to Vancouver. He lived just outside Vancouver. And the next day he had to go to the bank. But when he went into the queue, waiting for the bank, for the teller, and handed him the same bank book, the same teller, and stood on the same spot where he had panicked so often before, he panicked again, and it was a smasher. And he thought, what will I do now? I've had 18 months practicing getting used to. I've been to America, and I didn't panic. But now I panic, and it's worse than ever. You see, he had never faced the symptoms. He'd never learned how to cope them. He never learned that when you panic, you let your body relax and you let the waves sweep all over you. You see it right through. Panic is an electric flash. It's a superficial electric flash. And that I teach my patients, to go toward it, let it come, let everything happen to the body that will, with utter acceptance. We're changing the mood. We're reversing the pattern. From going into fear, we're going into losing fear through getting used to the actual symptoms, not used to the place. So that in the end, even though the panic flash may still come, and it probably will, it no longer matters as much. It's the no longer mattering that is the key. I teach them that these things no longer matter. And they have to have the doctor who's going to help them with this or the books to give them the courage to see it right through. So often, just at the climax of the panic or the symptom, they withdraw. And that's tension, that's more adrenaline, that's more stress hormone, and that is an even stronger experiencing of the symptom. It's utter acceptance, letting it come, even going toward, going out prepared to take what will come. Let one's body do what it wants to do. Don't check it, don't try not to panic, don't think of something else. Into it willingly, just as in Australia, when the big waves come, we don't stand up against them. We get dumped if we do. We go under them willingly. That's accepting and facing.
It's almost like tranquilizing yourself.
Yes, it is.
Rather than taking a tranquilizer.
Well, there is a place for tranquilization. I know a lot has been written about tranquilizers recently, especially. There is a place. Some people are so sensitized that it is almost beyond their capacity to go into panic, go into the symptoms, and accept utterly. I said almost. There are people who will not take tranquilizers and who do and who can. But I never ask that of my patients. Those who will, I support. And I think, good on you. But those who need tranquilization, I see that they get it at that stage in two ways. They get enough, but not too much. I still want them to feel enough panic to know that they have to practice facing and accepting and floating. And then there are times when they're so utterly worn out with practicing that they need a rest from it for a little while. And tranquilizers, perhaps just for one day, will give them that rest. Tranquilizers must be watched by the doctor. And floating is such an excellent word, really. You see, it implies more than relaxation. It is relaxation with action. You take an agoraphobic person who's afraid to walk to the supermarket. He can become so rooted to the ground with tension that he feels he can't make one step forward, and he does the very worst that he can do. He tries to force. I will go, I'll get there, I'll get there. And the more he does that, the more tension, and the more he locks himself in action. Now, if he were to let his body go utterly and think, float, don't fight, float. The very thought of floating unlocks the muscles. And in that way, he can float forward. He can float through a difficult situation. He can float through a situation at work of having to meet a boss, of having to meet situations that really get him down. I'm not going to stand up to this. I'm going under it. I'm going to float through it.
So you're saying then that you can use this method for both anxiety states, because you said there were two types.
That's
and
right.
You talked mainly
Right.
about
Yes.
the one where people had got into this vicious
Yes.
circle, but even for the person who does have a positive physical problem, they can still use that technique.
Yes, oh, definitely, in two ways. Because, first of all, they will eventually become afraid of their symptoms also. They'll be afraid of their so-called missing heartbeats and afraid of their thumping heart and their iron bad headache. They'll be afraid of those while they're contemplating their problem. But if they understand what they are, if they understand that the thumping heart is no more than the extra beat of a normal heart, I'm assuming they've been examined by their doctor, that takes some of the misery away so that they can more peacefully contemplate their problem and perhaps arrive at a solution.
Fatigue can often be one of the most distressing aspects of nervous illness. Tired minds can give rise to all manner of exaggerated or inappropriate thoughts. This was the problem which faced our patient Anne.
Nervous illness first started, well, not illness, but problems first started when I was 20. We'd had a burglar. I heard someone coming up the stairs in the middle of the night, and it was such a shock. It scared the daylights out of me. It would scare the daylights out of anyone, I think. And the fact that we never saw who it was, I heard someone coming in and running back down again, and I never saw him. And after that, I couldn't sleep because I was absolutely petrified. And it just broke my sleep pattern. And once your sleep pattern is broken, you just don't function as well. And at the time, I had an awful lot of stress because this was just before I got married, and I had all the arrangements to make for the wedding. I had all my trousseau to make because I'm not stock size, so I had everything to make. My dad was ill, he was in hospital, we had to go visit him, you know, and look after him. We didn't know if the wedding was going to be on or off. And in general, it was just a right lot of hassle at that time. And things just got worse and worse and worse. The more tired I got, the more frightened I got. And the next, you know, the less you can sleep, the more tired you are. So the next morning I was more tired, and the next day I felt worse. And I started getting worried about niggling little things. Make sure you turn the gas off properly. Go back and make sure. So I go back and back and back, and I didn't know if the damn thing was on or off in the end, you know. And I could spend hours. I just couldn't get out of the house because I couldn't stop checking the gas cooker and checking all the switches, etc.
Dr. Weeks, what do people mean by nervous fatigue?
They mean four things: muscular, emotional, mental fatigue, and a kind of fatigue of the spirit. But nervous fatigue develops so slowly, so insidiously, that the average nervously ill person doesn't recognise it. And the complicated symptoms that he can get, he thinks, are some strange thing doing this to him. He doesn't realise that this is only fatigue. For example, the fact that nervous emotions become so grossly exaggerated, he thinks that he is going crazy. He doesn't realise that fatigue nerves begin to get so aroused that they register emotions so acutely. Stronger, stronger, stronger. For instance, even joy can be felt almost hysterically. A sad sight can seem tragic. Noise can be heard. A noisy movie can be heard so noisily that the person will want to leave the theatre, will have to go outside. That is very, very confusing.
So, are people mentally ill when they reach that stage where they're overreacting to everything?
I don't think so, no. They're emotionally overreacting. It's an emotional tie-up. For instance, a woman watching her mother packing to go away for the weekend to her own little lonely flat. She was so emotionally tired, the woman had a nervous breakdown at the time, that the thought of her mother going to that lonely flat was so upsetting that she thought, how can I go on living feeling like this, But that was emotional. Her mental thought was all right. It was simply my mother is going to this lonely flat, how can I go on with this? She didn't realise that it was her that was reacting the wrong way, not the situation. And this is what one has to teach these people. It is your oversensitised reaction, not the situation. Learn to see that and learn to accept the oversensitised reaction until gradually you can let your reactions calm. But you know, while reactions are oversensitised and are reacting so strongly, they exhaust our supply of stress hormones and we become exhausted. And that is a type of adrenal depletion. Just as when you get a person with organic adrenal depletion that is not treated, and we call it Addison's disease, those people are so tired they can hardly lift a hand. I think that is what Jane Austen had. But the nervous exhaustion that comes to a nervously ill person is as tiring as that. They have exhausted their stress hormones.
So when they're in that exhausted state, what are the first things that you do to help them?
Explain what's happening to them and that it is recoverable. Instead of lying on the bed thinking, I'll never get out of this, look, I can hardly lift my hand. They have to get up off that bed, float off that bed and start moving, even though they're exhausted. They're not going to hurt themselves. It is amazing how quickly nervous exhaustion will heal if the person accepts it, accepts his jelly legs, accepts his weakness and works with it there. Sitting down sometimes during the day, yes, of course, and not doing unnecessary things, yes, of course. But from going out and having to lean on an arm for support, within 2 weeks he can be walking normally if it's done with understanding and utter acceptance.
Because I imagine some people might turn to stimulants at this time in their life. They think, oh, I must take some of these caffeine tablets or something just to keep me going. I suppose really they shouldn't touch them at all, should they?
Well, caffeine tablets are not only caffeine tablets are going to make their heart race too, and that's going to be a very upsetting thing. Stimulants, no. I never prescribed stimulants. In fact, very rarely did I prescribe tranquilizers, but as I explained in my last talk, they have their place. But mental fatigue does come into it too. And this is when a person has thought about his illness for so long, gone over and over and over it, that he, like a student who's been studying for too long, begins to feel that he can't concentrate, he can't remember, and thoughts stick. A very tired mind loses its flexibility, and that's when a person so easily develops a phobia or an obsession. It's as simple as that. It's simply nervous fatigue working in a mind, a tired mind with exhausting emotional reactions.
Can nervous fatigue develop from physical fatigue? You mentioned the young student there overworking. I can remember people having breakdowns when I was at college because they seemed to be constantly working very hard over their books. That seemed to be a nervous illness developing from physical stress?
I think you could work as hard as you liked over your books, providing you didn't become anxious because you were doing it. You have to add the extra stress of anxiety and fear of the exams, and finding that you were so tired you weren't able to take it in any longer. And my golly, you've only got a fortnight or 2 days, whatever it is, before the exams. Then the panic starts, and then the extra exhaustion of panic, the extra fear. I think that was the straw that broke the poor old student's back, not the amount of work done. You can work and work, you can become emotionally exhausted, you can become mentally exhausted if you don't panic because you are. If you understand what is happening to you and you say, well, I'm mentally exhausted, my thoughts come hauntingly, they come slowly. I will take time and my body will heal that just as will heal a broken leg. That is the cure. Reverse the pattern, as I say all the time. Reverse the pattern with acceptance, knowing what's happening and letting one's body heal itself just as it would heal a cut.
It's that acceptance again, isn't it, that you've been talking about in the last few talks that you've given. It's that relaxing into the situation.
It's the attitude of acceptance based on understanding. One can even accept without understanding and be cured. Many people who are cured through faith have done it through acceptance on faith, not on understanding. Utter acceptance can be there just on faith. But when it's based on understanding, it has a stronger foundation, a much stronger foundation.
Over the last few talks, we've built up a picture of the pattern of nervous illness. Now Dr. Claire Weeks continues her series, looking at the particular problem of phobias and obsessions, the cause of our patient Anne's nervous breakdown.
From time to time, you used to get assessed at the hospital. You had these cards and they used to say, does this bother you, does that bother you? And one of the things on it was pins and needles and broken glass. And because broken glass was tagged onto it, I suddenly thought, oh, I hadn't thought of that. And around about the same time, one of the dairies was prosecuted for having, I think it was a nail in a bottle of milk. And I suddenly thought, what if they smashed a bottle at the milk bottling plant? What if there's bits of broken glass in all those milk? What if they haven't checked them all carefully? And if I pour some milk into someone's drink, it's going to kill them, it's going to harm them. So after that, I had to sieve all the milk. And I became so frightened, especially in relation to food, that I got to the stage when I think we lived on boiled eggs, because you can't, nothing much can happen to them. I get absolutely sick of boiled eggs. But I could see danger everywhere and I had to be very much on my guard.
Dr. Weeks, are phobias and obsessions the same thing?
No, oh no, they're not at all. But they do overlap. A phobia is a persistent irrational fear. And an obsession is thoughts that preoccupy a mind to an abnormal degree. I don't like definitions, but there they are for you. A phobia can be, although it's a frightening thing to talk about and hear about, it can be very simply developed, as you see in Anne and have seen in Anne. And because of that, it can be very simply, in my mind, amongst my patients, cured. Now, I didn't say easily, I said simply. For instance, when a phobia develops, you have, as I explained in the talk on nervous fatigue, the ground already prepared. You have a sensitized person whose emotions are being exaggeratedly recorded, the person who feels, instead of fear, a flash of panic, instead of feeling that the sight is sad, feels that it's tragic. That person is in a position to get the wrong reaction to a certain fearful thought. And also, if he is at the same time mentally tired, he can get a sort of shock with it, and he doesn't forget it very easily. And this is how simply it can develop. There was
Because I was going to say, in Anne's case, I know that it all seemed to have begun from the fact that she heard a burglar come into the house.
Yes, she had a shock, but before that she was very, very tired. And the shock, as it were, brought such an intense reaction to her that she couldn't forget it. And because she was mentally tired, it stuck. But can I just talk about a plain phobia first? Somebody who has just an irrational fear of something. There was a nurse in a maternity hospital, let's deal with her, because her phobia is one that many nervously ill people have, and that is the fear of harming someone. And she was carrying a little baby just born to have its bath, and she was in such a state of sensitization herself that she felt disintegrated almost, as if she had no control really over her own thoughts. And you see, they were so emotional. And when she looked down on this little baby that was so helpless, completely at her command, as it were, she suddenly had the normal thought that anybody would have, oh, what if I, in my present state, would hurt that baby, to harm that baby? And then, because she was sensitized, that recorded that thought as, ooh, what if I hurt it on purpose? Such an easy transition. And she happened to be then standing beside a window. And then came the thought, what if I were to throw it out? So she rushed past the window. But whenever she came along that corridor with a baby, and she had to carry them through the day. Past that window, she hurried past the window. And from then on, windows brought back that fear, so that she became afraid to pass almost any window. She always got that whoosh of fear. And she went to a therapist for help, and he said to her, "You are an aggressive type. There is this hidden aggression." Of course, that made her feel guilty. So now windows meant guilt. It was compounding, it was building up. And I was able to show her how normal the situation had been in the beginning. Her reaction was normal in the circumstances of her sensitization, of her feeling that she wasn't secure within herself. How could she give security to a little one? That's normal. And isn't it normal to suddenly think from, if I might accidentally hurt, what if I did hurt? And that is how so many mothers, if they're listening to me today, have felt this about children. They are not aggressive types. They are only very tired, vulnerable people. And that is only a thought that they think. It has no substance at all. They would never hurt the children.
So when they think that thought,
Yes.
what else should they think?
Well, they do what I taught Anne to do. It is only a strange thought in a very tired mind. And they don't try to stop it coming, because that only underlines it in red. They accept the thought. They will think the thought. It's been their habit to think the thought, but they must see it for what it is, a thought in a very tired mind. They are not aggressive people.
They're often, it seems to me, very courageous people too, in the struggle that they often go through to try and come out of this nervous period in their lives. In fact, I remember reading in your one of your books, you said that one of the friends that you need is the friend courage.
Funnily enough, I have found that my nervously ill people are amongst the bravest people I've ever known, because they have to get themselves better from a state where they're practically on the floor with very little except the right inner voice within themselves to help them. You know, some people envy people who they think are confident, but very often the person who appears confident is only self-assertive. True confidence has to be earned, and it's a wonderful opportunity to have none, because you can start from rock bottom and get it. And these nervously ill people, they get it. And when they are better, if they've got better the right way, they're really integrated people. Now, Anne, as I explained, she to me was not only one of the bravest, but one of the most intelligent people I've ever known. And to go on the program the way she has shows great courage. And I hope that her friends and her neighbours appreciate that. I hope the whole district is proud of Anne, to think that she was willing to expose herself in this way for the sake of helping other people. She's a great lass, Anne. So that courage is there, bravery is there, but with Anne, it wasn't just a question of teaching her to know that this was just a strange thought in a tired mind. Anne had to glimpse and practice that. An obsessive person can't say, "Well, yes, you've explained to me, doctor, I understand," and walk out of the surgery cured. The minute they leave the surgery, the thought will slap them in the face again, and their body will react in exactly the same way, and they'll think, "I'm lost. She's told me all that, but I'm still doing it," you see? So they practice glimpsing, almost as one would practice playing the piano. When they have the obsessive thought, which is the wrong direction, almost compelling them, propelling them, that's when they practice. But it is only a thought in a tired mind. While that compulsion is on, it is only a thought. And for a moment, they will glimpse it without having the overwhelming feeling of compulsion. There'll be a little peace for a moment. That's what they build on. That's what Anne built on. It's a long, long way they have to go. But the answer is cure, as it is with Anne.
Dr. Wicks, there's one final question I'd like to put to you, because throughout this conversation you haven't mentioned agoraphobia. Now, is that because the problem is a different problem from other phobias? Or is it because the treatment is different?
The treatment's much the same. Agoraphobia does differ from other phobias. In my opinion, it's not a true phobia. It means fear of the open field, the marketplace, and there are people who are afraid of that, but are not afraid of going anywhere else. But we use the term agoraphobia to embrace people who are afraid of leaving home for fear they'll have a turn. They're afraid not of the outside, but of themselves. Will they panic? Will they collapse? What will they do in a situation? It's not that they're so much afraid of the school meeting or the hairdresser, but they're afraid that if clamped in the hairdresser's chair, they won't be able to get out quickly enough if they have a panic. And the answer is always the same. Utter acceptance, even of the panic. They have to learn how to take the panic. A deep breath, let it out slowly, let their body slump, and let the panic flash. It is only an electrical discharge. They must not let their life be ruined by an electrical discharge. See it right through. And because they're sensitized, it may linger on for a while, but why? What the heck if it lingers on? I know it can be so strong that they think it's impossible to bear. It is never impossible to bear. And it's only by going through that last 1% that they discover this. It's when they withdraw, just as they think it's getting impossible, that they make it more impossible and are defeated by it. But if they are prepared to see it right through, they find peace on the other side of panic. They went through it. They know it. They've done it. That is the way for them to cope with agoraphobia. To my mind, it is the only way.
Depression can be one of the most self-defeating obstacles to recovery from nervous illness. Dr. Claire Weeks has treated many patients for depression and has developed a special insight into how to offset some of its alarming symptoms.
I find that in my practice, depressed people came fitted into two main groups. There are the people who are not nervously ill, but who suffer from recurring bouts of depression. And then there are the people who, as a result of emotional fatigue and mental fatigue through nervous illness, finally become apathetic and then deeply depressed. You've got those two main types. Now, for the person with recurring bouts of depression, she invariably goes about curing herself the wrong way, or he goes about curing himself the wrong way, because I found that there are as many men as women who suffer with this kind of depression. You take a housewife, we'll forget the men at the moment, take a housewife who stands at her window, and at dusk she's looking out. She has had bouts of depression before. And there's just something about the dusk, the falling leaves, perhaps a distant church bell, something that just strikes a note inside her, and she feels her heart, as she thinks, go woof. And you know that little clutching hand on the tummy, and she thinks, no, not one of my bouts again. Oh. Now, if she's busy, and if she has the supper to get, and she goes ahead and does it, the chances are she'll forget. But if she has another one of those feelings, then she'll think, it's coming, my bout is coming. She becomes immediately apprehensive and afraid because she knows what they're like. She knows what it's like to go through a bout of depression. And now this is where she does the wrong thing. She starts to rush here and rush there to try and get rid of it. She'll rush to the supermarket, and when she's finished, she'll think, now, has it gone? Am I any better? Has it gone? And of course, the best way to remember something is to try so hard to forget it. And adding anxiety and fear of a bout onto that and rushing around, she becomes very tired. She becomes depleted, and of course that helps her to become more depressed, and the bout has begun. And of course the family will say, oh, Mum, get yourself up out of this one, you know, do something about this one. She's been doing it, perhaps for days, trying to get herself up out of it, and the more she tries, the deeper she gets into it. Now that is a perfect example of how not to manage a bout of depression. The way to manage it is, when she thinks that she's getting or feeling a bout of depression coming, let it come. Don't rush anywhere. Work at a steady pace. That's the secret. At the same steady pace. Let the feeling be there. Face it, have it. It is temporary depletion on her part. Some little thing has started it. She's perhaps been overtired. Work with it there. Relax toward depression. Take it with her. Don't try to lose it. Don't try to fight it. And while she relaxes in her thought toward it, her body will relax and her emotional battery will recharge itself, because she's not discharging it all the time with rushing here, rushing there, and tension. But very few people do that. They usually do rush, and they are tense, and they do add fear. I didn't talk very much about the person who becomes depressed as a result of nervous illness. That second type. An important thing there is that this takes time. When a person becomes depressed as a result of nervous illness, recovery takes time because they are so thoroughly depleted. And this is where a family, if they could only understand this, you know, Mum, come and play, have a game of cards with the Johnsons. It'll do you good. So poor old Mum gets up a courage and has cards with the Johnsons. And she doesn't come home any better. And they think, oh, Mum will never get better. Oh, Mum, we thought you'd enjoy it, you know. And she gets upset then because she's more tired after playing cards with the Johnsons. She's perhaps more depressed. That is depletion, and it takes time. They have to realise that when they've been nervously ill and they've been apathetic and then depressed, they have adrenal glands to replenish. A game of cards with the Johnsons alone won't do it. But she should keep going out and playing cards with the Johnsons, doing what she has to do, but not forcing herself. Realising there's depletion to be healed, food to eat, vitamins to take, sleep to get, and depletion to be healed gently.
In the last of Dr. Claire Week's talks, we turn now to the road to recovery from nervous illness. A road, however, which, though simple, is not always as straightforward as it seems. I asked Dr. Weeks about the setbacks which can delay the process of recovery.
One of the bogeymen that hide in the woodpile is memory, and it's always there to bluff and to persuade the person trying to get better that he won't get better, that he's not getting better. You see, as one woman said, I can get the children off to school in the morning, but it's when I'm over the sink that I go all weak and giddy. Now, it's the memory of all the other mornings when she stood at the sink and went all weak and giddy that is there to make her weak and giddy again. And what actually happens is simply that her very apprehension creates a production of more adrenaline than is usual. Adrenaline dilates the blood vessels in muscles, in her legs. The blood pools down into her legs naturally, leaves the top part of her head. She feels a bit faint and wobbly. She's done it to herself, but she doesn't know that. And memory is the old trickster that says, you'll feel weak at the sink, you know, you felt weak at the sink all those other days. Then memory works in another peculiar way. It works immediately and it works in the distance. There are two kinds. Now, memory working immediately. A person who's feeling depressed and who perhaps is tired of fighting to try and get better will suddenly feel not too bad. He's played a game of tennis, he's talked to people, he's been to a theatre, he's lost himself in watching the theatre, and suddenly, when it's over, memory strikes. He thinks, no, you're not like them, you're in a breakdown. And a wave of apprehension, despair will sweep all over him. I call that flashback memory. And he's got to learn to pass on through that, not to let memory try to hold him back, to draw him back. Also, there's the person who goes away for a holiday and who's fine when he's away for a holiday, goes into cafes, goes on buses, does things he hasn't done perhaps for ages before. But as soon as he sees the home, the same rooms, the same houses, the same shops, memory, 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 memory and sight, memory and sound, memory and smells. And not only that, because he has suffered the symptoms of nervous illness, memory brings feeling back. It's not just thought that comes back, it's thought and feeling. And the feeling can be very acute because of what he's been through. His nerves know the way to bring the feeling, not only perhaps the trembling hands, but the whole orchestra. The headache, the tummy, everything.
How does he handle a setback like that? Or don't you consider that to be a setback?
No, funnily enough, I teach my patients that a setback is a set forward. I like them. And I like them when they have one, to think, well, this is what Dr. Weeks likes, and this will give me another chance to practice what I have to do. You see, in between the setbacks, they gather hope and they have a rest from their suffering. They learn more in a setback. A setback is more experience, it's more confidence. And finally, they are able, by coming through setbacks, to build up an inner voice that says, you've been there before, old chap, you know the way. You know the way. On, forward, don't go back. Through. That inner voice is the thing that will support and direct. To me, that's the beginning of recovery. And it can only be there if it's been earned. Facing, accepting, floating, and letting time pass. And that takes time, and that may mean many setbacks. So many that he knows the way out so well that he no longer fears the way in. And when you hear some therapists say, there's no such thing as recovery, one said that to me on television in New York. He said, Dr. Weeks, we do not speak of recovery with nervous illness, we only speak of remission. So I said to her, well, I've treated so many and have seen so many recover that I'm not afraid to talk of people with nervously ill people recovering. But to me, recovery means not never having any symptoms again. We'll all have stressful symptoms as long as we live. But recovery means knowing how to accept them and go through them and cope with them so that they no longer matter. No longer mattering is the key. And the right inner voice can so often be misunderstood by therapists. You see, there are many, many methods of treating nervous illness. And when I spoke at White Plains Hospital in New York this year, and I spoke to psychiatrists and psychologists, I knew that some of them, of course, would treat their patients differently and that they had great faith in their methods. And the last thing I wanted to do was to criticize anybody's method, because providing they cure by it, it's a good method. But in the talk I gave, I stressed that whatever the method, the one goal that we must all have is for the patient to develop the right inner voice. Now, a woman journalist, she was an English woman, wrote an article for a journal, magazine, about 4 years ago, and she said, I've been agoraphobic for 2 years. I can now go anywhere, providing I take these 3 little pills, 3 times a day. It was a certain pill. The other kind didn't suit her, but this particular pill. And now she said, I can go anywhere, and all I have to do is to come off the little pill. I noticed she wrote the article before she tried to come off the little pill. She might be all right too, providing the day she came off the little pill, she said to herself, well, you don't need any more pills, you can go here, you can go there, you can do everything. You're right, no more pills and you won't need them. She'd be right temporarily, if she were to meet the same stress in the future that had originally caused her agoraphobia, what would she do? She had no inner voice. She would say, "Where are my pills?" And what then if a voice within her said, "Old girl, you're depending on pills. Suppose these pills don't do the trick this time." Where was she then? An inner voice, the right inner voice, should be the goal of every therapist. He should see that his patients develop the right inner voice through having made their own effort, having failed and practiced again, until finally they learn that they themselves can take themselves through any experience by facing, accepting, utter acceptance, floating and waiting until the symptoms no longer matter.
Throughout our talks, you've implied that much of the improvement that you can make to yourself really comes through self-help. But how much support do we need from the family, from the doctor?
Marion, many people have to recover with no support from either family or doctor, and they do it. But if they can have support, that is fantastic. You see, Anne has had wonderful support now from her husband, and I'm sure that has made all the difference in the world now to Anne.
Yes, because we have over the week seen how Anne has struggled. She struggled over many years and went through many different types of treatment before your words helped her. It seems that the right words at the right time can obviously help a number of people.
Oh, you've no conception of how important your statement is. As the right words at the right time help, so the wrong words at the wrong time can condemn to a life of misery. And that's why every doctor should be so careful of what they say. People take a doctor's word so seriously. I think for a doctor to do as little harm as possible with his words is so important. And I think that's what I did for Anne. I really showed her simple words and the right way, just when she needed it most.
Dr. Weeks, thank you very much indeed for all the help you've given us over the weeks. And my thanks are not only from me, but from Anne too. And I think it would be very apt indeed to end with a little bit of our film of Anne, and you can just see how well she is now.
Thank you, Marion.
When you've been as ill as I was, and an obsessional illness is one of the nastiest things in the book, and I've had it in good measure, and I've had it for a long time, and I've had every treatment there is, and I've had a lot of experiments done. And when you've had that sort of illness, that sort of background, and you're better, and you get over it, you take a delight in just being alive, just peace in your head. If anyone were to ask me if I'm happy, I would say, oh yes. You know, it's all the everyday things everyone takes for granted, just being with my family, having us all safe and well, and a happy marriage. It's things that sometimes people say maybe a bit humdrum, but if you've not been in hell, you don't know what heaven is, you know. And it's absolutely super so.